in Gaza, taken together with the Ukraine crisis, derail the US pivot to Asia to contain China? I'm Tom Switzer, and this is Between the Lines. John Mearsheimer is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and author of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that was published in 2001, and The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities, that was published in 2019. John, welcome back to Australia.
Glad to be here, Tom.
Now, this is your third trip here, correct?
That's right.
Now, first 2010 at the University of Sydney. I think you reaffirmed your 2001 thesis that China's rise would not be peaceful.
That's right.
Then 2019, when you debated Professor Hugh White in Canberra, I think that was in front of 550 people.
That's correct.
And I think that year too, you debated the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd on this program about Australia's choice, China and the US.
That I did.
And now, 2023, here in Brisbane this week to address the latest Middle East crisis.
That's right.
Okay, well, summarise succinctly your position in the wake of the October 7 terror attacks in Israel.
Well, this is a disaster. First of all, it's absolutely horrendous what happened to those Israelis who were killed by Hamas, especially the civilians. And what's happened since then is that the crisis has spun out of control. The Israelis are now threatening to invade Gaza, and at the same time, they have cut off all water and food into Gaza. They are, in effect, starving the Gazans, and they are relentlessly bombing Gaza. And furthermore, what is happening here is that there is a danger that a war will break out on Israel's northern flank between Hezbollah and Israel, and that Iran even may get dragged in. So the potential for escalation here across the Middle East is great, and this will be a disaster for everyone, but most importantly, it'll be a disaster for the Palestinians in Gaza.
Doesn't this, though, demonstrate the imperative of US leadership in the region, that the kind of leadership that you've railed against in recent years? And I ask that because if you look at both Russia and China, they've tried to inject themselves in the region. Moscow with Israel, Beijing, of course, helped broker peace talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Yet since October 7, neither Moscow nor Beijing has been able to play any kind of role in diffusing tensions or providing solutions. The imperative of American global leadership. John.
Well, this is a failure of American leadership, but let me explain exactly what I mean by that. The taproot of the problem here is obviously the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. And the United States has been deeply involved since at least the Carter administration in trying to facilitate a two-state solution so that the Palestinians would have a state of their own, and the Palestinians would not feel oppressed by the Israelis, and we would not have the present situation that we're in. The Americans have been unable to get Israel to accept a two-state solution. We have been unable to make a two-state solution work. And the main reason for that is we have been unwilling to put significant pressure on Israel to move to giving the Palestinians a state of their own. So that's a failure of American leadership. And that failure of American leadership has led to the present disaster. Had the Americans been willing to use coercive leverage against the Israelis and against the Palestinians and push both sides to accept the two-state solution, we wouldn't be in this crisis today.
Hasn't Washington, though, over several administrations, pressed the Israelis to stop building settlements?
We have pressed them, but not very hard. There's no question that American policymakers, again, since the Carter administration, have understood that it is imperative for the Palestinians to have a state of their own. But the question is, how hard were we willing to press the Israelis to get them to accept a Palestinian state? And the answer is not very hard.
Have you been struck by the fact that President Biden, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, the Defense Secretary, Austin, have all paid visits to Israel, high-profile visits to Israel during a war?
No, not really.
Could you imagine Presidents Bush or Obama or Trump doing this?
No, I don't think that any of those previous presidents, except with the possibility of Trump, who's unpredictable, would have done that. And I think that what is going on here is that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken have long made it clear that they have a passionate attachment to Israel. And given that passionate attachment that those two individuals have, it is no surprise to me that they have embraced Israel and they have backed Israel at every turn.
But hasn't the Biden administration also cautioned Israel to be careful about not going in too big to devastate Gaza completely?
I think that there is no question that the Biden administration has gently reminded the Israelis that they have to be careful when they go into Gaza and not to create too many civilian casualties and not to get themselves into a situation, a long-term situation that looks like the one the United States got into after 9/11. But whether they succeed is another matter.
Well, President Biden has made it very clear to Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership that they should learn the lessons from the U.S. disastrous decisions after September 11.
Well, he's made it very clear, but it's not apparent that that's going to have much effect on how the Israelis behave. I think the Israelis are by and large independent actors here, and they're going to do what they think is in their national interest. And I think there's a good chance that the Israelis will foolishly escalate and end up in a situation not unlike the one that we ended up in after 9/11.
And I should stress now's as good a time as any. My guest is Professor John Mearsheimer. John was one of the leading intellectual opponents of the Iraq invasion in 2003. Now, John, on this program since October 7, I've interviewed leading American defenders of Israel, Daniel Pipes, Elliot Abrams, and they insist that destroying Hamas not only justified but realistic. Question, would a ground invasion into Gaza in response to the Hamas attacks on October 7, would that be wise? You're implying that this would not be a wise course of action. Why?
Well, I do not think that an Israeli invasion into Gaza can solve the basic problem here. The basic problem is that you have about 7.3 million Palestinians inside Greater Israel, and about 2.1 million of those Palestinians are in Gaza. And as long as those Palestinians don't have a state of their own, they are going to rebel against the Israelis. And going into Gaza and getting rid of Hamas is going to be extremely difficult. But even if the Israelis are able to get rid of Hamas, the fact is that another organization will pop up that is as hostile to Israel as Hamas is. So this is a situation where the Israelis cannot solve the problem with military force. This is a problem that is political at its root. Again, it has to deal with a Palestinian and an Israeli state living side by side. And we are far away from that outcome and therefore in real trouble.
Are you overlooking, and this is what your critics would say, John, are you overlooking the vile, vicious nature of the Hamas jihadists? This is Jason Riley, past guest on this program. He's with the Wall Street Journal, and this is a quote from his recent column. Quote, Hamas has never hidden its intentions. It's an Islamist organisation dedicated to eradicating Israel by killing the Jewish people who live there. And Jason Riley goes on to say, Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution or any other compromise. Its objective, stated explicitly in its founding documents, is the annihilation of the Jewish state, period. Now, that's Jason Riley in the Wall Street Journal. Given that Hamas is responsible for this bloodshed on October 7, doesn't it stand to reason that Israel has every right to annihilate this organisation?
I have 2 points to make. One is that your comments assume that Hamas represents all of the Palestinian people, and Hamas does not. If you go to the West Bank, where there are many more Palestinians than there are in Gaza, what you see is that the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas is in favor of a two-state solution. Furthermore, Yasser Arafat, who preceded Mahmoud Abbas, was in favor of a two-state solution. And I am certain from looking at polls that there are many people who live in Gaza who do not support Hamas and do favor a two-state solution. That's point one. Point two, it's important to understand that Hamas, right, although it definitely is bent on destroying Israel at this point in time, right, has indicated in the past, as Jimmy Carter has made clear, that it might be willing to accept a two-state solution. And in fact, you want to remember that the PLO under Arafat initially was opposed to a two-state solution and wanted to eliminate Israel, but over time it changed its viewpoint because it understood that Israel was not going away. There's no reason that we shouldn't try to convince Hamas to go down the same road that the PLO went down. Maybe it won't. And if it doesn't, I would not blame Israel for remaining in a combat situation with Hamas. But the point is here, it's imperative from Israel's point of view, in my opinion, to try to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Palestinian people.
But I mean, the Palestinians here are hardly innocent here. I mean, you think of the intifadas or the uprisings in the late 1980s and the early 2000s.
But the intifadas are just like the uprising on October 7th. The intifadas were a result of Israel suppressing the Palestinians, preventing them from determining their own fate, for keeping them under their thumb. This is what the occupation leads to. And the American policymakers since Carter have understood that if you want to solve this problem, we need a political solution, which means a Palestinian state.
You say the Israelis are suppressing the Palestinians, but and you mentioned in passing Arafat's about face. Of course, in 1993, 30 years ago, September 1993, we had the Oslo Accords, those famous scenes of President Bill Clinton with Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. But at the Camp David peace accords in 2000, isn't it true to say that the Palestinians were offered and they rejected close to what was being offered? That is 93% or 94% of what they had. So didn't Arafat and the Palestinians make a big mistake back then?
No, this is the conventional wisdom in the West for sure, because the Camp David Accords failed. And of course, the Israelis and the Americans blamed Arafat. And that's the story that they tell. But if you look carefully at what happened there was never any final agreement. There's no piece of paper, no plan that was put forward that Arafat rejected. They had lots of conversations between the relevant parties about how to solve the problem. And they never came up with a final deal that Arafat rejected. It just was going nowhere. The negotiations at Camp David were going nowhere, and they broke away. And I would point out to you, Tom, that Arafat had asked beforehand that Clinton make sure he not blame the Palestinians if there was no agreement at Camp David, because Arafat was opposed to the Camp David negotiations because he thought there was not enough agreement beforehand to reach a deal at Camp David. And of course, he was correct. And he anticipated that the Americans and the Israelis would blame him, which of course they did, even though he secured a promise from Bill Clinton not to blame him. And then my final point to you is it's important to understand that the Palestinians, and this is under Arafat, and the Israelis continued to negotiate after Camp David. They did not give up hope. What ended those negotiations was that Ariel Sharon became the prime minister. He replaced Ehud Barak, who was the Israeli prime minister at Camp David.
My guest is Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. He's been in Queensland in the past week as a guest of the Centre for Independent Studies. That's a classical liberal public policy think tank that I head. John, does the Israeli public trust Netanyahu to lead these wars?
Well, I think at this point in time, the Israeli public has no choice but to back Netanyahu to the hilt and, in effect, trust him.
Even though he's presided over this massive security stuff-up?
Yes, because he is in charge at this moment of great crisis, and you are invariably going to have a rally around the flag effect in such a situation. So it is hardly surprising that the public is backing him now. The interesting question is what happens once the dust settles. And I think that once the dust settles, he and the defense minister will be pushed overboard because they will be held responsible for this disaster, as they should be.
Yeah, any analogies with the 1973 Yom Kippur War with the then Prime Minister Golda Meir?
Yes, Tom, the situation is very similar. In 1973, as many people remember, the Israelis got caught with their pants down. The Egyptians attacked across the Suez Canal into the Sinai, and the Syrians attacked on the Golan Heights. And the Israelis were completely surprised. Golda Meir was then the prime minister of Israel, and Moshe Dayan, the famous general, was
the patch.
With the eye patch. He was the defense minister. And the Israelis suffered some significant defeats in the early days of that war because, again, they were caught by surprise. But they then recovered, and they won stunning victories against both the Syrians and the Egyptians. And Golda Meir remained in power, as did Dayan, during the fighting and for a brief period after the fighting. But eventually, when the dust settled, both Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were pushed overboard, and their political careers were effectively ended. And I would surmise that that is what's likely to happen to Netanyahu and the defense minister.
Okay, so back to Netanyahu, October, November 2023. If the ground operation succeeds and Hamas is destroyed, I say if, because it is a big if, and there's an Israeli-installed regime that governs Gaza after Hamas, I mean, what are the likely consequences for the region?
Well, I think that that's extremely unlikely to happen. And I think in the process of trying to make that happen, the Israelis are going to be sucked into a war in Gaza that is likely to last for months and maybe even more than a year. And in the process, they're going to end up killing huge numbers of Palestinian civilians. And this is going to do really serious damage to Israel's standing, not only around the world, but also in the West, to include the United States. And on top of all that, I would be shocked if they are able to destroy Hamas completely. And I would be shocked if once that unlikely scenario pans out, they are able to put into place a government in Gaza that is willing to live happily ever after with the state of Israel. So I think they're really getting themselves into a terrible situation.
Yeah, is this, by the way, and you mentioned Ariel Sharon a moment ago, who put the brakes on the two-state solution scenario with the Palestinians when he replaced Barak. Is this why Sharon, and we have to remember Sharon was one of Israel's most decorated soldiers, and most right-wing political figures. Is this why Sharon chose to get out of Gaza in 2005?
Yes. I mean, I think Sharon understood that it was much too difficult and too costly for Israel to try to continue controlling Gaza, to have Israelis living inside the boundaries of Gaza and keeping the peace in that region. I think he believed it made much more sense to withdraw the settlers, the Israeli settlers from Gaza, and turn the place into a giant open-air prison, which is what happened.
Okay, we've been talking about Gaza. Israel's battling Hamas, and not just Gaza, to its west, but it's also got West Bank. Now, about 100 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7. That has not been getting much attention in the media. And then, of course, they've got troubles in southern Lebanon to Israel's north. Do you think that the Lebanese Shia militia outfit Hezbollah, is it conceivable that it will launch a serious attack on Israel from the north?
It's definitely conceivable. The question is, how likely is it that Hezbollah and Israel will get into it, in which case Israel would be facing a two-front war?
What's in it for Hezbollah to launch an attack on Israel, given that Lebanon is a mess?
Well, Hezbollah is a mortal enemy of Israel, and the argument is that Hezbollah is so profoundly affected by what is happening in Gaza, that if Israel were to go into Gaza and kill even more Palestinians, Hezbollah organization would feel compelled to come in on behalf of Hamas. And by the way, Tom, some people argue that the same logic applies to Iran. The Iranians have hinted in rather opaque language that if Israel sends ground forces into Gaza, they will react. Now, what that means, we don't know. And the same thing is true with Hezbollah.
Yeah, well, some news sources, I mean, you mentioned Iran there, they say that shortly after Hamas's assault on Israel on October 7, they say, this is the Wall Street Journal, and they relied on Hamas sources. They reported that Iran had greenlit the October 7 attack.
I don't believe that. And both the Israeli government and the American government have said that there's no evidence to support that. There is no question that Iran supports Hamas and that Iran provides military equipment, other resources, and money to Hamas. But that's different than saying Iran controls Hamas, that Iran helped plan this attack and encouraged Hamas to launch it, which is the argument that newspapers like the Wall Street Journal are making. We just don't have the evidence to support that.
Now, just finally on the Middle East question before we turn to Ukraine and Australia's region, the Asia Pacific, there have been many pro-Palestinian protests, many anti-Israel protests across the Western world, especially on American university campuses. Have you been struck by the extent of this anti-Israel sentiment across the Western world?
Not at all. I mean, two things have happened. First of all, with the internet, it's easy for people to see what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, not just now, but over many years. And furthermore, it's possible for people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians or who are Palestinians themselves to write articles and write op-eds in news outlets that filter into the West. So many people in the West, especially young people, are fully attuned to what's going on inside of Greater Israel, and there is a tremendous amount of sympathy for the Palestinians. On top of that, if you look at the demographics inside colleges and universities in the United States, you see that there are large numbers of foreign students who are not sympathetic to Israel, and there are growing numbers of Americans, especially in the Hispanic community and in the Asian communities, who are not sympathetic to Israel the way old-time Americans were sympathetic.
Well, to the extent that those trends continue, in coming decades, can Israel be so confident on that kind of unconditional, unqualified support that you say the Americans have been giving Israel for so long?
Well, Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States depend on influencing policymakers inside the executive branch and congressional leaders both in the House and the Senate. And Israel itself and the Israel lobby in the United States have been very successful at influencing the leadership in Congress and in the executive branch. And that accounts in good part for why you have this terribly close relationship between these two countries. The problem is that if you go below the elite level and you start looking at the public, what you discover is that support for Israel, especially inside the Democratic Party and especially among people under the age of 45, has eroded significantly. And this is a great cause of concern for Israel's supporters, which is hardly surprising. I believe this situation only gets worse with the passage of time. And I would argue if this present crisis goes on for a long period of time and the Israelis go into Gaza, that this will do serious damage to Israel's image in the West, not just in the United States, but across the West, and especially going back to your point on college and university campuses across the West.
You're listening to me, Tom Switzer, Between the Lines on RN, and my guest is Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, whom Catherine Yahi-Milo, This is in the new edition of the prestigious Foreign Affairs magazine in New York. She calls John, quote, one of the most famous political scientists in history. John, now to Ukraine, where the long-awaiting Ukrainian counteroffensive is stretching into its, fifth month. Now, from your perspective, what's the state of play on the ground right now, 18 months since the Russian invasion?
I think that it's quite clear that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is petering out. It's almost finished. And
even with all that Western aid and support?
Well, the fact is that the Ukrainians have failed to make any gains on the ground against the Russians. And furthermore, they have suffered enormous casualties. It's quite stunning, if not sickening, to see what the level of casualties have looked like over the past 4+ months on the Ukrainian side. And much of their equipment has been destroyed as well. So the Ukrainians are in no position to continue this offensive. In fact, if you are playing the Russian hand, you're Russia, you should hope that the Ukrainians continue to attack, because you are inflicting, you the Russians, so many casualties on the Ukrainians. So I think one could argue from a Ukrainian point of view, it's too bad that this offensive, or counteroffensive as they call it, didn't end 2 or 3 months ago. In fact, I argued long ago they would have been better off not starting the counteroffensive and remaining on the defensive.
Well, you are once again going against the Western conventional wisdom. I mean, my understanding is that whether it's left-leaning publications like The Guardian or right-leaning publications like The Australian and The Daily Telegraph and The Wall Street Journal, Western commentators are at one. They seem to remain optimistic that Ukraine will indeed prevail, and with that Western support, they'll inflict damage on Russia. This is the former US General David Petraeus. He is very confident. He told CNN's Fareed Zakaria just last weekend that Russia will eventually crack and crumble.
I think if you look carefully, as I have been doing at the Western media since the counteroffensive started early June, that what's happened over time is that there have been a growing number of pieces in the Western media that make the argument that the Ukrainians are not only in deep trouble, but they're not going to win this war. There's no question that there are people like David Petraeus, and if you read newspapers like the Daily Telegraph and the Wall Street Journal, you'll see optimistic pieces still popping up. But along with those optimistic pieces are a growing number of pessimistic pieces, because people understand the Ukrainians are in deep trouble. And by the way, Tom, I would point out that the war in Gaza is likely to hinder the West's effort to support Ukraine.
Yes, I mean, you're obviously very pessimistic about Ukraine's prospects, but isn't it true that the Russian base in Crimea, this is the naval base of Sevastopol, that's had to be evacuated basically because of the Russian losses due to the, and this is Petraeus' point, the very clever maritime drones that Ukraine has developed. Again, Petraeus is not alone here. They say that the boosters of Ukraine, that Ukraine has hit the actual headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet during their command and staff meeting. I mean, I suppose the point here is your critics would say you're underestimating Ukraine's military capacity to inflict real damage on Russia.
My response, at the risk of sounding flip, is who cares what they're doing to Sevastopol? It just doesn't matter.
It's the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet.
So what? This is not a naval war. This is not World War II in the Pacific, where you have the German Navy up against the British and American navies. This is a war that's being settled on the ground. This is a land war. And what you want to ask yourself is, what do the balance of forces look like between the Ukrainians on one side and the Russians on the other side? The Russians have an overwhelming advantage against the Ukrainians on the ground, and they have just stymied their counteroffensive and inflicted massive damage on the Ukrainian forces. That's what matters, not what's happening at Sevastopol.
John, I've been presenting Between the Lines on RN for the best part of a decade, and if my memory serves me correct, I think you were one of probably my first guest on the program. I think you debated Timothy Schneider on the causes of the Ukraine crisis. This was a decade ago when Russia went into Crimea. Now, you subsequently, I think it was in early 2015, gave a lecture at the University of Chicago where you spelt out your thesis. It was based on your famous 2014 Foreign Affairs article around the time you did the interview with me. And you maintained that NATO expansion, the EU expansion, the US support for the color revolutions, this has just provoked Russia. Now, for the last 10 years, you've been demonised by so many people, even though that lecture is now, by the way, at 30 million views on YouTube. But wasn't it striking? I mean, you must have felt it odd when Stoltenberg, the leader in NATO, basically conceded that NATO expansion had provoked Russia.
The Stoltenberg comment was truly amazing. I mean, as you correctly said, I've been kind of a lone voice in the wilderness since
persona non grata, except for the ABC.
Yes, to put it mildly, accused of being Putin's apologist and so forth and so on.
In the pay of the Kremlin, even.
In the pay of the Kremlin, right. But I've long argued that this is not a case of Putin acting as an imperialist trying to conquer and absorb Ukraine into a greater Russia, that what is really driving the train here more than anything else is NATO expansion. This is not to take away from EU expansion and the color revolutions, which you described, but NATO expansion was the heart and soul of the problem from the Russian point of view, and that's what provoked the war on February 24th, 2022. But what's happened now is Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, has come out and said in considerable detail exactly what I have been arguing since 2014.
How do you account for this?
I can't. I'm very thankful for sure, because you can point to it and I can point to it as evidence that I'm not sort of making this up, but I don't know why.
This is all very relevant for any discussion about a peace settlement between Ukraine and Russia, because Moscow presumably demands that Ukraine can't be part of NATO, correct?
Correct.
And Kyiv, of course, wants Russia out of the Donbass and Crimea. Those demands aren't likely to be met, right?
I think it's almost impossible to imagine the Russians giving up the territory that they have already annexed. And I want to underline the word annexed. And it includes more than the Crimea and the Donbass. There are two other oblasts that have been annexed. Well, I think what's likely to happen is that this war is going to go on for quite a while. And I think the Russians will end up conquering more territory than they now control. And at some point in the future, it's hard to say exactly where or when, you will end up with a frozen conflict. There'll be a ceasefire, there'll be a frozen conflict. The Russians will annex a substantial portion of eastern and southern Ukraine, and they will go to great lengths to continue to keep Ukraine in as a dysfunctional rump state.
Yeah, but your critics would say that's still a big setback for Russia, given that in February of 2022, Putin was bent on conquering, occupying all of Ukraine. That's been a big defeat for Putin, hasn't it?
There's no question that that's a myth, that he was bent on conquering all of Ukraine.
Even though he sent tanks to Kyiv?
Well, you want to remember that the Russians invaded at the very most 190,000 troops. And there is absolutely no way that 190,000 Russian troops could have defeated the Ukrainian military, which we had trained and armed, and conquered all of Ukraine. Remember, you said all of Ukraine. As I like to point out, when the Germans went into Poland in 1939, and it's important to understand that the Germans were only bent on conquering the western half of Poland because the Soviet Union was in the process of conquering the eastern half of Poland. So the Germans sent in 1.5 million troops to conquer the western half of Poland. Ukraine is much bigger than Poland as a whole, and certainly much bigger than the western part of Poland. To conquer all of Ukraine, Russia would have needed at least 2 million troops. I would argue they would have needed 3 million troops. They went in with 190,000. The Russians were not interested in conquering Ukraine. They were not interested in conquering Kyiv. They wanted to drive Ukraine to the bargaining table so they could reach a deal. And in fact, they succeeded in driving Ukraine to the bargaining table, and the Ukrainians and the Russians were working towards a settlement to the war. The war had already started, and the Russians and the Ukrainians were negotiating in Istanbul and working out an agreement. And what happened? The Americans and the British came in and told them, walk away.
But back to Ukraine, October, November 2023, doesn't the Western failure to save Ukraine damage US credibility in defense of Taiwan? I ask because Xi Jinping seeks a Chinese-led order that favors the world's autocracies. Beijing has backed Putin. In fact, China, as you well know, has a no-limits partnership with Russia. So wouldn't Putin's defeat do a lot of damage to Xi and China because they've backed a loser?
Well, the fact is that Xi knows the United States is committed to Asia and that the United States is committed to containing China. Now, I think there's no question that America's deep involvement in Ukraine and America's deep involvement now in the Gaza situation detracts from America's ability to concentrate on containing China. But there is no question in my mind, and I believe there's no question in China's mind, that the United States remains firmly committed to containing China. There's nobody in the Biden administration, and in fact, I don't know anybody in the foreign policy elite who doesn't understand that the principal threat that the United States faces on the planet is China. It is the number one threat, and we are committed to containing China.
But isn't it also your thesis that because the United States is going to be increasingly distracted by this new Middle East crisis, taken together with its focus on helping Ukraine defeat Russia, that hurts the US pivot to Asia to contain China, right?
Absolutely. I think there's no question about it that it's not in America's interest to be deeply involved either in the Gaza war or in the Ukraine war, because great powers, in my opinion, have only limited bandwidth. They only have so much time in the day to focus on problems. And if you're spending a huge amount of your time focusing on the problems in Ukraine and the problems in Gaza, that's time you don't have to spend on thinking about how to contain China and how to put together a balancing coalition to contain China. So there's no question that this is hurting the effectiveness of our effort against China.
And that means that from Beijing's perspective, is it fair to say that the best outcome would be precisely that Washington remains deeply committed and frustrated in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, so the US can't fully pivot to East Asia?
Oh, I think the Chinese are ecstatic about the present situation that the United States is in. And there's one other dimension to this, Tom, that's very important to mention. And that is that in an ideal world, the United States would have Russia as an ally against China. You want to remember, we're in a multipolar world where there are three great powers: China, the United States, and Russia. And it's in our interest. This is Balance of Power Politics 101. It's in our interest to have Russia on our side of the ledger. But by getting deeply involved in Ukraine against Russia, what we have effectively done is push the Russians into the arms of the Chinese.
And they're not natural allies.
They're not natural allies.
Yes, but that horse is bolted. I mean, the Kremlin and the Chinese Communist Party are now tied to the hip, right?
Yep. Huge strategic mistake on our part. But the point I'm making to you is you just don't want to emphasize the fact that we are taking our eye off the ball in East Asia by focusing so much attention on Ukraine and Gaza. That's problem number one. Problem number two is we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese.
Yeah, okay, but just back on this anti-China coalition that the United States is trying to cobble together in the Indo-Pacific region. Obviously, we've seen a lot of success despite all those skeptics about the Quad, America, Australia, India, and Japan. And then there's also now AUKUS with the United States, Britain and Australia. But given that the states in East Asia, they have their different priorities and their different interests, many of them are still heavily dependent on China for trade and prosperity. Was it ever conceivable that the United States could really generate a coalition of states to hedge against China?
I think it is possible to put together a balancing coalition or an alliance to contain China. It is possible, but it is important to emphasize that it is very difficult to do that. And the reason is that you're talking about a large number of states, and they're spread out all over the place. I mean, if you think about the Quad, India is in the Quad, and Japan is in the Quad, Australia is in the Quad, and the United States is in the Quad. Those are the four countries. They are spread out all over God's little green acre. It's really quite amazing. And India has somewhat different interests than Japan does. So getting these countries to coordinate is really very tricky. And you want to remember that on top of these multilateral alliances that we've put together, like the Quad and AUKUS, we also have bilateral alliances, the U.S.-Japan relationship, the U.S.-Australia relationship, the U.S.-South Korea relationship. So the United States has to do a lot of hard work here at the diplomatic level to keep all of these countries on the same page, to keep them working together. And the problem that you face is that if you're deeply involved on a day-to-day basis in the Gaza war and in the Ukraine war, you're not going to have that much time to spend on putting together and keeping together this balancing coalition in East Asia.
And that brings us to Australia now. This intensifying US-China security competition that you've predicted for more than 2 decades is clearly happening. And all the available public opinion polling in this country supports your claim that Australians do have a deep-seated interest in working with Washington to deter China. But Beijing has recently, John, as I'm sure you know, it's gone to great lengths to try to accommodate Canberra. Clearly that wolf warrior diplomacy has failed. Australian governments have given up nothing for China to reach out to Canberra. They've in the process of freeing Australian citizens who've been detained since COVID. Beijing's ended the COVID-era trade sanctions. The Chinese are meeting Australian ministers, even the Prime Minister soon in China. I mean, do you see a sign here that Canberra may well be reverting to its old position of just being on the sidelines in this great power security competition in our neighbourhood?
I think there's no question, as you describe it, that the Chinese understand that wolf warrior diplomacy was a disaster, and they misplayed their hand with regard to Australia. They did. And they're trying to rectify that now. And I think what you'll see over time is that there will be a great deal of economic intercourse between Australia and China. But at the same time, there will be intense security competition. And this is going to be true all across Asia. There is going to be a great deal of economic intercourse between China and virtually all of its neighbors. But at the same time, there will be an intense security competition. And I think, Tom, this situation is analogous to what you saw in Europe before World War I, where you had a great deal of economic interdependence among all of the countries in Europe. This included Germany and France, Germany and Russia, Germany and Britain. But at the same time, you had this economic intercourse, this significant amount of economic cooperation. You had an intense security competition between the Triple Alliance on one side and the Triple Entente on the other side. And in July 1914, the security side of the story ended up dominating the economic side of the story, and you got, on August 1st, 1914, World War I.
And in your realist view of international relations, security almost always trumps prosperity.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, you told the Australian newspaper recently, and this was the Washington correspondent, Adam Crichton. There was an interview with him, and you said that the AUKUS Security Pact erodes Australian sovereignty and ties Canberra to the US in the event of a military confrontation with China over Taiwan. Tell us more.
Well, there's no question that what's going on here as the United States puts together this balancing coalition in East Asia, that countries like Australia, and Australia is hardly the only country here, get pulled into America's orbit. They get pulled into the alliance. And when you're in an alliance or you're in a balancing coalition, it's almost always the case that you end up going into combat with the leading member of that alliance should a war start in any particular area. So I think what the Americans are going to try to do is they're going to try and get Australia intertwined in this alliance in a meaningful way. And I think that if a war were to break out over Taiwan, the Americans would expect both Japan and Australia to participate. Now, what exactly participation looks like is very hard for me to say at this point in time because I just don't know enough. I think that the Japanese are more likely than the Australians to be directly involved because of geographical proximity to Taiwan. But nevertheless, I think the Australians would at least be indirectly involved with the Americans and the Japanese in a war over Taiwan.
Well, oddly enough, this is one of the points that the leading critics of AUKUS make, and I think of former Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating, I think with whom you've had some dealings in the past. I mean, Keating makes your point. He's a critic of AUKUS. He says that AUKUS dilutes Australian sovereignty and makes it even more likely that we would be involved in any kind of US-led war against China. And he would argue, and there's a segment of the population, they're probably a minority, but they would say, why should Australia, so far away from Northeast Asia, get dragged into this conflict? Why can't we just sit on the sidelines, keep having trade with China, and maintain a security relationship with Uncle Sam?
Well, argument, it is a legitimate argument, but I think it's outweighed by a different argument, which is that Australia has a vested interest in containing China and making sure it doesn't dominate Asia. And furthermore, Australia has a deep-seated interest in preventing war from breaking out. And the argument I would make is that if Australia works with the United States and Japan and India and all sorts of other countries in East Asia to put together a balancing coalition that is highly effective, that makes war much less likely, which is in Australia's interest. And furthermore, it does a great deal to contain China and prevent it from dominating Asia, which is in Australia's interest. So that would be my argument for pursuing AUKUS. But I understand the Keating argument, which is that once you get involved with the United States, you run the risk that a war will break out and you will get dragged in. You cannot deny that basic fact, but you have to weigh those two arguments together.
So you don't think that Australia, and this is what Keating, John Howard, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, and Tony Abbott did, you don't think we can still ride two horses simultaneously?
Well, again, I think there will be a great deal of economic intercourse between China and Australia. But there will also be an intense security competition. What many Australians have long wanted, and this was the modus operandi during the unipolar moment, was to have nothing but economic intercourse and to have no security competition.
The end of history as well.
That's correct. Well, that is the end of history scenario. That's exactly right. And what happened after about 2017 is that we began to transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. That's when it was becoming apparent to all sorts of people that China was a great power and that it was interested in throwing its weight around in East Asia. And in fact, I think it became clear to almost everybody that the Chinese were interested in dominating Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. So you then had to figure out how you thought about security competition, right? And how that related to economic cooperation. So you now have a world today where you have security competition and economic cooperation, and that's not going to change. So it'll be good news for Australia that there will be continued economic intercourse with China. But what a lot of Australians don't like, and it's somewhat understandable, is the security competition that is now set in and the fact that the Australians are being pulled into this balancing coalition with the United States and other countries in East Asia. But they have no choice, in my opinion, at this point in time.
John, you've been on the program countless times during the past decade. It's a pleasure to have you once again on the program and face-to-face here in Brisbane.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
Wonderful to have you in Australia, John. That's John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and author of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. That was published in 2001. Well, last weekend, Australia lost a leading political figure in Bill Hayden, a Labor leader from 1978 to 1983, Foreign Minister from 1983 to 1988, and then Governor-General from 1989 to 1996. I knew Bill Hayden reasonably well, and the last time I saw him was in 2015 when I conducted an interview for this program. Here are a few extracts.
G'day, Bill. Thanks for having me here.
You're welcome, Tom.
Let's talk about your ideological odyssey. You came to Parliament as a 29-year-old socialist-leaning member in Ipswich, but your worldview changed dramatically during your 35 years in public life. How?
Well, John Maynard Keynes has a great response to that sort of thing when he was once chided for changing his mind on something on which he'd been rather dogmatic. He said, I found I was wrong, and when you find you're wrong, I find it best to change my mind in the face of new facts.
This is what you said in your memoirs about Gough Whitlam. The most fulfilling, exciting days in my life were with Whitlam. I would not exchange them for a crock full of gold. It is rather presumptuous of me to say this, but I wish we had teamed up earlier in economic management. Whitlam was a great man. Together, we would have made the scorecard on our government's performance a considerably better one than what we, in fact, ended up with.
Well, I felt that. Gough said some things like that to me in private conversation. But he also used to say to me, Hayden, knowing I'm an atheist, the church will get you in the end. And let's use its proper word.
Well, listen, we've just marked the 40th anniversary of the dismissal. Now, history has been very unkind to the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr. You've had a different view. In your memoirs, you said, quote, I only hope that today, when just about every person and institution involved and buffeted by those events in 1975 has been rehabilitated, that Kerr will be looked upon in a kinder, less subjective light. After all, he did not create the crisis. As the vernacular has it, he was on a hiding to nothing whatever he did. Why do you think history has been so unkind to John Kerr?
It was the biggest constitutional historical eruption this country's ever had. And it allowed passions. Politics is a strange sort of business in a way. It's not an intellectual discipline so much, although there's plenty of intellectualism to be fed into what's going on. Certainly Gough sought to do that. That went wrong in ways.
That was Bill Hayden with me on Between the Lines in 2015. Well, that's it for Between the Lines this week. And if you'd like to listen to past programs, including my recent exchanges with Elliot Abrams and Daniel Pipes, they put forward a different perspective on the Middle East crisis to John Mearsheimer. Just go to the ABC Listen app and search for the Between the Lines podcast, which you can download for free. I'm Tom Switzer. Bye for now.